A Dictionary of Ukrainian Emotions.
Welcome again to the Dictionary of Ukrainian Emotions podcast. I am your host, John Friedman. First, allow me to begin with a few words about our project, which is presented by Ukrainska Pravda, Ukraine's most popular internet portal. Over 9 podcasts, we are presenting 9 works by 9 authors, all of them members of the Theater of Playwrights in Kyiv. Furthermore, they all contributed text to an English-language anthology titled A Dictionary of Emotions in a Time of War, 20 short works by Ukrainian playwrights. This award-winning collection was compiled and edited by yours truly and published in 2023 by the Great Laertes Press in the United States. Every text in the book was written in 2022 in response to the full-scale Russian invasion of Ukraine. The text presented in today's podcast is a touching and compelling monologue titled My Terra by Lyudmyla Tymoshenko. It is inspired by the author's memories of Gone with the Wind, her favorite novel in childhood. Lyudmyla is a playwright, a screenwriter, and graphic artist, and she holds a doctor's degree in philosophy. She has written over 24 plays that have been performed throughout the United States and Europe. From 2010 to 2022, she taught in the Department of International Relations of the National University of Bioresources and Nature Management in Kyiv. Following the full-scale Russian invasion of Ukraine, she relocated to Germany, where she has collaborated primarily with the Schauspiel Stuttgart. As a graphic artist, Lyudmyla creates images that are joyous and often ominous at the same time. They are colorful, folkloric in mood, but especially since the beginning of the full-scale war, they have not shied from challenging and provocative themes as well. Reading My Terra today is Sharon Washington. Sharon, like Lyudmyla, is a multi-talented individual, achieving award-winning success both as a performer and a writer. Her solo play, Feeding the Dragon, which tells the story of growing up in the New York Public Library, launched her writing career in a major way. In 2024, she was nominated for a Tony Award for the Best Book of a Musical for New York, New York. As an actor, Sharon has performed in over 60 films and television programs and has performed at many of the most prestigious theaters in the United States, including the Actors Theater of Louisville, the Guthrie Theater, the Yale Repertory Company, and Arena Stage in Washington, D.C. She has workshopped numerous new plays at the Eugene O'Neill Center, Sundance, and New York Theater Workshop. The combination of Sharon Washington reading Lyudmyla Tymoshenko's My Terra is an interesting one, for Sharon told me that Gone with the Wind was of no small importance for her when she was a girl. Only in her case, it was a point of contention between her father, who loved the story, and Sharon, who did not. Please stay tuned after the reading to hear Sharon's and my discussion of her approach and response to Lyudmyla's work.
A Dictionary of Ukrainian Emotions.
My Terra by Lyudmyla Tymoshenko. There is a scene in Gone with the Wind, the funeral of Gerald, Scarlett's father. Before closing the coffin, Will asks Scarlett to go into the house, saying she is pregnant and might lose her child in the heat. The old woman accompanying her says, "He just didn't want you to hear the coffin being nailed shut." And he's right. Remember, Scarlett, until you hear that sound, the person seems alive to you. But as soon as you hear, yes, it is the most frightening sound in the world. It is the sound of the end. I was 12 years old when I read these lines. At that time, I lived with my grandmother Tanya in Ovruch, in the Zhytomyr region of Ukraine, When I was 7 months old, my parents had sent me from North Kazakhstan, which is where I was born, to live with her. My father served in the Strategic Rocket Forces. What does that mean? When rockets were placed on combat duty, they had to be kept under constant control. They were guided via underground command posts, and they were called Satan's warheads, the largest nuclear rockets of the time. There were 24 of them in my dad's garrison. Officers sat underground keeping constant watch over these rockets. Every officer on duty knew that if he were to receive the order, he would have to press a button. There were 3 types of readiness. Number 1 was constant combat readiness, whereby a green signal light was constantly on in the bunker. Number 2 was increased combat readiness, which was accompanied by a blue light. The third was engagement danger. For this, a red light was lit, and the officer on duty would turn on all devices that eventually would direct the warheads toward their target. All that was left was to push the red button. The officer on duty knew that by pushing that button, he could destroy a city 10 times the size of Hiroshima and Nagasaki combined. I was sent from North Kazakhstan to live with my grandmother in Ukraine because the climate in Kazakhstan is not suitable for a 7-month-old child. 10 months of winter and the rest is summer, as the locals joked. 40 below in winter, plus 40 in summer. I was often ill. My older brother, Serhiy, stayed with our parents. He, a 5-year-old boy, was very scared. Like all Soviet children living in such military bases, he feared nuclear war. At the age of 5, he knew perfectly well what unauthorized behavior was. The topic was constantly discussed among parents, kindergarten teachers, neighbors, shop assistants, and even hairdressers in beauty shops. The officers on duty were usually men of strong endurance and ironclad psyche. From time to time, however, their nerves might crack. The nerves they experienced in the control room staring at the color of the signal light made some of them go crazy. Mental aberrations like this had to be detected or foreseen in some way. Otherwise, this so-called unauthorized behavior might actually transpire. That is, if a duty officer realized he had the power to flatten planet Earth all on his own, he might succumb to the notion he could do anything he pleased. Such system failures might occur not only in a particular person's head, but also in the bunker's control system. There once was an incident when something went haywire, and the red signal light came on completely by accident. While the officer on duty, sweating with animal terror, aimed the rocket at its target, the command center managed to issue the proper directives to rescind the order. I was not afraid of nuclear war because I lived with my grandmother. She ate dumplings with cherries in summer and mashed potatoes with gravy in winter. My grandmother took me sledding, drove me to see the New Year's tree, and every Victory Day on May 9th, we would attend the parade of flags, rejoicing at the peaceful sky over our heads and our victory over fascism. My grandfather died in 1958. During World War II, he fought on various fronts, repairing military aircraft. He met my grandmother in Germany, where, like many girls, she had been transported by train from Ukraine and forced to work in German factories. After the war, my grandmother and grandfather, along with my father's newborn older brother, Valery, named after test pilot Valery Chekholev, moved to a garrison in Belarus, in the city of Baranovichi. When my dad Victor was 9 years old, his father died. Over the Easter holidays, Grandpa went from Belarus to his native village in the Zhytomyr region and got caught up in the tradition of going house to house. This is when, on holidays, from morning to night, villagers visit their neighbors and drink moonshine. He then returned to his family in Baranovichi and died of a stroke. He so missed my grandmother that immediately upon arrival, he climbed on top of her and his heart burst. He was 38 years old. My grandmother, my father, and his brother Valery remember the sounds of the nails being driven into the coffin. 8 months after grandfather's death, grandmother decided to return to her relatives in Ukraine. She and her 2 sons were given a room in a communal house in the town of Ovruch. Grandfather's family asked for permission to transport his body to his native village near Ovruch, and, to make this happen, Grandma sold her last valuable possession, a war trophy, a German accordion captured during the war. The coffin was dug up, covered with fir branches to hide the smell of the corpse, and reburied in Grandpa's hometown cemetery. To this day, Dad can't stand the smell of pine needles. Then my grandmother was given the house where I had come to live from North Kazakhstan when I was 7 months old, and where I lived until I was 8, at which time my parents took me to Lviv. This red brick house was the happiest place I've ever known. On every school holiday, I flew there on wings. Actually, I traveled by way of the Lviv-Luhansk Railway with a train change in Korostin. I've always strongly associated the smell of the jasmine growing near the house with the beginning of everlasting happiness. School would end on May 25th, and on May 26th, I would luxuriate in the smell of the white flowers from this bush. There would be 3 months of wonderful, carefree time ahead of me. That summer, I received a 2-volume edition of Gone with the Wind as a gift. This book was in short supply, and to get it, you had to turn in more than 20 kilos of waste paper. I imagined myself as Scarlett O'Hara, and I saw my grandmother's house as Tara. A whole new wonderful world opened up for me. The parts about the war bored me, but I reread the parts about Scarlett and Rhett many times over. When I read those lines about the sounds of the end, I was frightened for the first time in my life. I realized that one day my grandmother would die, and I would hear those sounds. Fortunately, that didn't happen until I was 40. My grandmother outlived her husband by 53 years. And when she was buried in the family cemetery in the village, the locals said they still remembered Grandpa's coffin, which had been covered with fir branches. Grandma died at the age of 92. The women who dressed her in her funeral gown tied up her opened lower jaw with a handkerchief. They pulled the knot so hard that Grandma smiled in her coffin. I was prepared for the sounds of the nails going into the coffin. I was not ready for the sounds of rockets flying over Kyiv at 5 a.m. on February 24th. I was not ready for the sound of the air raid siren outside the window of my Kyiv apartment. I was not ready for my mother to spend 8 days under fire in occupied Irpin without water, gas, electricity, or mobile communications until she was evacuated. Most of all, I was not ready for several shells to explode 300 meters from my grandmother's house in Ovruch, where my father Victor now lives. Our neighbors' houses were completely destroyed, and the roof of my childhood home was partly blown off, while all the windows were blown out. Dad called me and said, "Lyuda, listen to this sound." It was the sound of my Tara's windows being hammered shut with boards and plywood. It was the true sound of the end. for which I was not prepared. I was not afraid at the age of 5, but I now am afraid of nuclear war, because the president of Russia, the country that attacked my Ukraine, shows all signs of that unauthorized behavior. I am afraid of falling asleep and never waking up. My brother, Serhiy, who is currently a surgeon on 24-hour duty at a hospital in Kyiv, told me, in North Kazakhstan, every adult and child knew what dead hand was. That was a system that could launch rockets at the enemy without human intervention, even if a nuclear strike in our direction had been inflicted earlier. As such, there was nothing to fear. But fuck knows if anything can stop it. P.S. My dad's brother, my uncle Valery, named after the great test pilot Valery Chokolov, now lives in Bryansk, in Russia. He and his family consider us fascists, and they support the Russian president in this war.
A Dictionary of Ukrainian Emotions.
Sharon Washington, it's good to be with you today.
John Friedman, it's good to be with you as well.
You read one of the most popular pieces that we selected for the podcast. This piece has been performed something like 50 times around the world since we translated it and put it out, and it's been very popular. If I remember correctly, you told me that Gone with the Wind was one of your favorite novels when you were a kid. Is that true?
Well, it's sort of true. It wasn't one of my favorite pieces. It's actually the film was a source of controversy in my house because my parents loved it because they were older and were of that time when the film Gone with the Wind was like a big deal, Technicolor and, just all that. I found it as a young Black woman really hard to watch those performances of the happy slaves and Miss Scarlet and all those characters. What I realized in reading the piece is that I never read the book. I only know the film. So it was wonderful for me to read the piece and think, oh, the book is probably very different than what the film actually ended up being. So there was always a fight in my house between myself and my father, who had a love-hate relationship with it because he was from the South, from South Carolina. So he, and an older Black man. So I have an interesting relationship. I actually write about it in my play.
In that case, I want to ask you, because I got to know you because of your play Feeding the Dragon, which is about you living in and growing up in the New York Public Library. Jump from arguing with your father about Gone with the Wind to walking the corridors. And apparently, with all of those books around you all that time, you did not make it to Gone with the Wind. You didn't find your way to the book.
No, I didn't. And I honestly believe now in talking to you and thinking about it, I'm sure it was intentional because the movie was such a, like I said, such a bone of contention in my house. I was like, why would I read the book? So it's making me now want to actually go back and read the book.
Tell me a little bit about your fascinating childhood and how it turned into a huge play that has been done everywhere. Filmed and recorded for audio. You're going to do a children's book or something? Is that what I saw?
Yes, I am.
Holy
Hopefully
Moses.
Coming out next year. Yeah. We're working with an illustrator right now. Scholastic has me under contract to write a children's book version, which is going to be a little different than the play, because as you know, the play was on the darker side, dealing with my father's dragon of alcoholism and my mother's depression. Like within the happy story, there was also me growing up in that kind of a household and what that was like and what the library meant to me, being sort of my babysitter. But the picture book, because it's for young children, it's 5 to 7. So it's going to be just the little girl who lived in the library and all of her adventures with her dog. And, so I'm excited about that. But living in the library was was the fairy tale. I mean, it's funny, I don't have anything to compare it to because that was home for so long.
Sure.
So I'm used to having the keys, the big keys to the front door of the library and always locking it behind me. And I was an only child of older parents. So like I said, the library really acted as my babysitter, my grandmother.
For the people who are listening, you need to tell us why you were living in the library.
Yes. So my father was the custodian for the library. Our particular library, I've lived in 3, and the first one I lived in was the St. Agnes branch, which was on the Upper West Side of Manhattan on 81st Street in Amsterdam. And back in the day, all of those old buildings in the city were heated, like in many cities, by coal furnaces, giant coal furnaces that had to be fed, thus the title, Feeding the Dragon. And the furnaces were almost the size of half of a room, and they were down in the basements, and they heated the entire, 5-story building. And there was one custodian to do that. So per library. So it was a lot of really hard work, stoking the furnace and making sure it didn't go out, because that's all the heat and the hot water for the building and for our apartment. So there were custodial apartments inside the libraries because the furnaces had to be watched pretty much 24/7. So there were several all over the city and in other places in the United States, actually.
Right.
So that was the reason that we had an apartment inside the library.
Just a moment ago, you said when you were talking about what you're going to do for the children's book, you said within the happy story. And it occurred to me that within the happy story is a perfect lead-in to My Terror, the tale that you just read, because
Yes.
there is this wonderful, remembrance of family life and grandmother and grandfather and living with the grandparents in the summer home. And there's a line in the piece of the red brick house was the happiest place I've ever known. And there's this, this wonderful stuff. And then
Yes.
in the last 3 paragraphs, it all goes to waste, literally.
I think that's one of the reasons it affected me so much, and why I really wanted to do it was not only because of the Gone with the Wind and the Tara reference, but that sense of home and what home means. And as artists, when we speak to that, I think it's such a place of connection. It makes larger issues much less abstract when you can connect with the smell of jasmine in the house, or you just have an immediate visceral connection to this person, to this story. And I knew exactly what that house, that red brick house, meant to her, because it feels like my description of the marble steps in the public library. It's those things that we remember that make it home, that make it the magical place. But as with me and with my story, I talk about the flip side of the fairy tale with the problems growing up. So the flip side of my fairy tale was dealing with some of the family issues. And the flip side of this fairy tale is that it becomes a place that is destroyed, and it just rips apart the fabric of the fairy tale.
Yeah. And of course, there's an inkling that that's coming this way, partly from the novel, the sound of the nails being hammered into the coffin.
Yes.
She tells us right up front that something's coming,
Yes.
here. And then also the remembrances of the nuclear weapons place,
Yes.
that people worked in the town that she grew up in.
No, what I'm going to say is what I found, talking about that, the nails in the coffin, what struck me, I think, was it snuck up on me because I didn't, when she talks about nailing the boards over the house, like I got she laid it in the beginning, and then she talks about her grandmother's funeral and how she was ready for that. She was ready for those nails, right? I wasn't expecting the image of the nails in the coffin of the house.
Right.
Is sort of a really very different image, which is a wonderful, again, a visceral, like, oh, that sound and what that meant. And so anyway, that's what it was an unexpected turn for me.
Right. Have you encountered Ukrainian writing before? Is this a first for you?
No, this is my first time. I'm thrilled. It's absolutely been such a treat and a joy to work on it and experience it and get it in my teeth and in my mouth and explore it. It's other than having a little trouble with the pronunciations.
Well, that's okay. We all do. We all have trouble with that's perfectly understandable.
It's been great, yes.
Yeah. I did send you a link to some of Lyudmyla Tymoshenko's artwork, and I'd just like to have you respond a little bit if you can. I personally am an enormous fan of her artwork. I think she's a brilliant artist. She works, by the way, with just regular pieces of paper that she paints on, if you will, with colored markers.
Wow.
It's not watercolors. It's not paint. It's colored markers on regular sheets of paper. And what she does in that medium is, I just find astonishing.
It's pretty incredible. And now that you told me what she works in, it makes sense, because I think I was struck by the vividness of the color, so markers, they have a very particular look, and I didn't know I didn't know if it was, I couldn't tell from the images I was looking at whether it was paint, or I just knew that there's something, it's graphic, and graphic in the sense of graphic novel graphic, but also graphic in the sense of what she's addressing in her art. So I think it's the perfect marriage of the two. It's just very striking. And again, I just keep using with her work, the word visceral comes up, because that was my response to her art.
Right.
It's on that level. It just hits you in your sort of gut. And I don't mean this in a derogatory, in a very, almost not primitive, but like it just hits you on a level that's very, what would be another word for that? I'm searching for a word here.
I find primitive is actually a very positive word for me. I always say that she's playing around in the genre of folklore. You know, she's playing with folklore. And actually, she does that in this piece too. It's not true of everything she writes, but in My Terra, that red brick house, you're walking down a little lane, you know, in the meadow.
Absolutely. Surrounded by jasmine, and
she luxuriates in the smell of white flowers.
Yes.
Lovely little phrase that she has there.
What a perfect picture. But that's great. It's folklore. Yes, that's what it reminds me of. It reminds me of some of the old, I am going back to my fairy tale imagery, some of the old fairy tales and some of the images in those old fairy tale books that were very folklorish, like the one about the guy with all the hats on his head that comes through town. And there's a very like folklore tale. That's perfect. That's exactly right.
Yeah. And, you know, her drawings of elderly Ukrainian women, you kind of imagine that when she's telling a story about her grandmother, that they might have looked a little bit alike.
Yes. Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly.
There's something very approachable, something very recognizable in her writing and in her artwork. They just kind of draw you in, and you feel like you're part of it, and you feel like you're part of her world, even though, you know, you're not. I'm not. And yet, as I look at those her paintings, and as I've translated several of her pieces, you know, I feel as if she's somebody I know, and I'm somebody that she knows.
Absolutely. No, that's the exact feeling I got.
Isn't that what you want in a work of art as an artist? You want people out there, you go up on stage and you want people to relate to her. Yeah, I know her.
Exactly. Exactly. One of the best compliments I've ever gotten was I did a matinee performance, and there were all, you know, matinees are historically, happened to be in Pittsburgh when I did the first iteration of the play, and I performed, and it was in the afternoon, and those are always hard. And it was a much older audience, and mostly did not look like me. And I thought, oh, this is going to go over like not well. And afterwards, this older woman and her husband, and she must have been in her age, she came up to me, she said, we couldn't be more different. This silver-haired lady, we couldn't be more different, but that was my father.
Yeah.
That's what you want, right?
Right.
I can imagine, I feel like I know her father, her grandmother, you know, you just feel like you know these people. And that's what art does. It humanizes people. It makes us less other, which is, you know, anyway.
And that's marvelous, because it's a short, brief paragraph about her grandfather dying. The way she tells the story of her grandfather's death, that he loved his wife so much that he climbed up on top of her and died. I mean, we're both laughing right now. It's not funny, but she intended for us to laugh.
Yeah. Yes. It's really wonderful. It hits on so many different levels, the story, and the personal becomes universal. So it's pretty great.
That's wonderful. I'm so grateful that you had an opportunity to read this piece, Sharon. You did a beautiful job, and I look forward to putting everything together and having everybody else have a chance to listen to what you've done too. Thank you so much for joining us for this podcast.
Thank you so much. It's been my pleasure.
A Dictionary of Ukrainian Emotions.
Thank you for joining us for this, the 8th and penultimate episode in the Dictionary of Ukrainian Emotions series of podcasts. In all, we have been offering 9 texts written by founding members of the Theater of Playwrights in Kyiv, all published in English in the anthology titled A Dictionary of Emotions in a Time of War, 20 Short Works by Ukrainian Playwrights. As does Lyudmyla Tymoshenko's My Terra, which you have just listened to. Every one of these texts stands as proof of the power and resilience of the Ukrainian spirit, the riches of its culture, and the beauty of its language. Our next and final podcast will feature the Kosovo-born American actor Kushtrim Hodja as he performs 3 attempts to improve daily life, a first-hand impression of life on the front lines of war by Maxim Kurechkin. Please join us for that. I am your host, John Friedman, and I look forward to you joining us for the next and final episode.
A Dictionary of Ukrainian Emotions.